If I seek God and avoid the problem of evil, I fool myself. Because if there is a God, evil is God's hardest problem. And if there is no God, evil is no God's easiest evidence. Posing the problem of evil is simple. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, how could such a supreme being possibly exist in light of the enormity of misery and suffering that surely exists? Solving the problem of evil is complex. Theologians and philosophers have clever ways, but do any of them work? Do any of them satisfy? I have to face up to the problem of evil, but can God? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my long journey to find out. Because I want God to exist, I want to solve the problem of evil, or at least reduce its God-negating power. So I speak with very smart believers who offer solutions. These solutions are called theodicies, which are proposed explanations to the age-old mystery: how can an all-powerful, all-good God coexist with massive, monstrous evil? I start with a world-renowned philosopher of religion, the author of Evil and the Love of God, John Hick.
John, the problem of evil is specifically acute for those who would believe in a personal God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. As a Christian, how do you deal with the problem of evil?
We have to distinguish between moral evil, that we inflict upon one another, and natural evil, things like earthquakes and drought. Now, concerning moral evil, how can an all-powerful God allow us to do the things that we do to each other in war and in the structures of society, which is so unfair to so many people? Well, we have to take account of human free will. We are free to act rightly or wrongly. And when we act wrongly, we have all the various forms of moral evil. But there still leaves natural evils, which are not due to human failures. I think what one has to say that we have to ask, what is this world for? And I think the Christian answer, this is a place of soul-making, or I would rather say person-making. And a person-making world must not be a paradise on earth in which there are no problems, no obstacles, nothing to challenge us. It has to be rather like the kind of world that we find, in which there are problems and challenges and difficulties to be overcome, because it's these that are person-making.
If I were to accept that argument, it may make sense for the totality of humanity to have this kind of world so we can be person-making, but it so horribly differentiates the oppressor from the oppressed that it seems incompatible, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, to allow such a huge differentiation to happen to individuals in order that the totality be according to God's wishes.
On the other hand, how can there be human free will and then God prevents us from using it?
I think the answer is that it can't. So some would therefore conclude that the God who is postulated to sit below this whole concept is incoherent, is contradictory, and therefore I reject the God. Others would say that in order to solve the ultimate problem, you need some kind of an afterlife.
You're quite right. This is essential to any adequate response to the problem of evil. It isn't all put right in this life. There does have to be a continuation of life.
All right, let's go to the natural evil.
Well, not only is freedom necessary for person-making, but also the kind of world in which we are, in which there are all these uncontrollable challenges and difficulties.
And in your mind, that justifies the evil of the
That
world.
plus life continuing beyond this life. You do need both.
John claims that for God to make persons, the world must have freedom and uncontrolled challenges. But that's not enough to justify all the evil. There must also be an afterlife, says John. Then I think of all the horrors. If God is God, shouldn't there have been a better way? This I know. If I am ever to believe in God, I must resolve, if not solve, the problem of evil. I must explore the other side. Not the mountains of horrors, those I see, rather what the horrors mean. I drive south to London, where I meet a philosopher who seeks to save us from being willing slaves of claptrap, Stephen Law.
Stephen, it just seems that it doesn't work for a God who is supposed to be all good and all powerful to have the amount of evil in the world.
When people talk about the amount of evil that exists in the world, they're usually referring to the evidential problem of evil.
So how would you define that?
Well, we're focusing now not on the existence of some evil, but on the quantity. And it's suggested that this quantity provides us with good evidence that there is no such all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. So here's an analogy. Take a look around you at the world. It contains a great deal of good stuff, undoubtedly. You know, love, laughter, and rainbows. We all love that stuff. This makes it highly unlikely, surely, that the universe was created by a supreme being that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely evil. And if that's true, and I think most of us recognise that it is, then the question arises, so why isn't the sheer quantity of horrible stuff in the universe, why doesn't that give us very powerful evidence against the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God? The evidential problem of good, if you like, is a problem for those who believe in an evil God. The evidential problem of evil is the mirror problem for those who believe in a good God. And most of us recognise that the evidential problem of good is just fatal to belief in an evil God. So the question then is, well, why isn't it? Why isn't the mirror problem fatal to belief in a good God? And I'm inclined to think that it is.
I have to ask, who am I to decide where that cutoff is between a little bit of evil, which makes life interesting and makes life a struggle and makes it challenges, and so much evil that it is beyond question that there's no God? I mean, where is that demarcation line? I don't think I can judge, and no. I hate to say it, I don't think you can either.
Oh, yeah, we can. Because, look, it may be that there's no sharp line where you can say, draw the line here, and this is precisely the point where it becomes untenable, belief in a good God. But as the amount increases, so it becomes more and more of a problem, belief in an all-powerful, all-good God. There's not just human suffering and the evil that humans do. So there's this huge quantity of appalling suffering spread over hundreds of millions of years, and it seems to me that it does provide overwhelming evidence against the existence of a deity of that sort that's all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good. There may be some kind of cosmic intelligence, there may be something back there, some kind of person even, but it's certainly not an all-powerful, all-good one. We can be pretty confident about that, it seems to me. Now in response to that, people might say, but look, we're dealing with God, and God has a mind that is beyond our comprehension, and that this ultimately may all be for the best. We may not be able to explain why there are hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before we show up, but then perhaps there is some good reason for it. Show a little humility, for goodness sake. You're a mere human being. This is the mind of God. You should expect there to be things that you can't understand. Now, if that
you did that pretty well.
Yeah, I know. Then now I'm going to do it with the evil God. The evil God is no less intelligent no less, his mind is no less inscrutable. It may be that this really is the worst of all possible worlds. Yes, there's good stuff, but ultimately it's all for the worst. It's just that we're not in a position to understand how. The question is, well, if that's just obviously evasive nonsense, when it comes to defending belief in an evil God, why isn't it evasive nonsense when it comes to belief,
First of all, let me do
in a
this.
good God?
Let's say that God is dealing with eternal life. We're dealing with a human life that's less than 100 years. Even if it's all pain and suffering, if there is some ultimate payoff, then that would be certainly statistically worthwhile. I would sign up.
Compensatory afterlives, you can use that to defend belief in a good God, but you can just as effectively use it to defend belief in an evil God. It's perfectly obvious that there's more than enough good stuff in this world for us to be able to recognise that there's no evil God. And similarly, the appeal to the afterlife, similarly ineffectual. There's more than enough bad stuff in this life for us to be able to see that there's no all-powerful, all-good God. And alluding to some pie in the sky when we die doesn't really deal with that problem.
If an evil God does not exist in light of some good, how then can a good God exist in light of great evil? Does this parallel argument work against God? By itself, it's too simple, I think. But I am not sure. I am sure about this. The horrific quantities of evil, all manner of anguish and agony, should give any believer pause. What about me? I'm stopped by the obstacle of evil. I try to move the obstacle by lining up arguments. Believers seek to reconcile God and evil, to explain evil, if not to justify it. But do these believers really get the enormity of such evil? I speak with a mainstream believer. I go to Oxford to meet a systematic theologian, the Reverend Professor Paul Fiddes.
Well, first of all, I'd want to say that there can be no complete rational answer to this huge problem that faces humanity. If we could completely answer the question about how there could be evil in a good creation, then in a way we'd be diminishing the kind of impact of suffering on people because we'd be explaining it away. But we can begin, I think, to think reasonably about this in a way which makes room for us to make a leap of faith. And the best way to begin is, I think, the question of freedom. That God has created a universe with its own freedom to be itself. Not just so that beings within the universe can make choices, but so they can be creative, so they can do new things and contribute to God's own project in creation. And so God has given this radical freedom to the whole of the universe at every level. But with that gift of freedom, which includes randomness as well, within that gift of freedom, there is the terrible possibility of drifting away from God's purpose, of not conforming to what God knows will make for fullness of life. Now, Christian thinkers have thought of that falling away from the good as being evil. It isn't something created. It doesn't have its own being. It's a turning away from the good. And so it is strictly nothingness. And yet, of course, it has this awful power, destructive power to it.
You do believe that God created everything that there is other than God itself? Yes?
Oh, indeed, yes.
Yes, okay. So if I put these two things together, I have to ask you, when God made everything, did God know for sure that all the evil was going to occur?
Well, this is why I say there could be no completely rational answer to the problem of evil. I'm not saying that evil is a logical necessity within such a free world, but it is extremely likely, and indeed in practice, inevitable. Therefore, it seems in building this foundation for faith, This only becomes tolerable if we say God shares this risk with us. That God also enters into a world which has a destructiveness within it, which comes from evil. And God suffers with this world, in empathy with those who themselves are suffering. So the big question that you're asking, I think, is it worth it? That's where the leap of faith comes. You see, by talking about the freedom of the world, by talking about God's own involvement in the suffering of the universe, and by saying that it's through that involvement that evil can be overcome through suffering love, so that God does everything possible to overcome evil, one builds a foundation for taking the leap of faith of saying, yes, it is worth it because of the nature of human persons, their relations with each other, and the other deep relations within the cosmos outside human life. It is worth it, but that's going to be a step of faith.
Paul recognizes that to explain evil, a leap of faith is required. So believers must think reasonably, he says, to make room for a leap of faith. Forget completely rational. Try any rational. So Paul goes for radical freedom in God's creation. So freedom for earthquakes, tsunamis, animal killings, paralyzing viruses. Natural evil is the immense suffering not caused by human error. That's why I speak to an atheistic philosopher who wields the problem of natural evil as if a scalpel to excise the entire idea of God. I go to London to meet Anthony A.C. Grayling.
The real problem for the writers of the Theodicies is natural evil, the existence of disease and disaster, and the arbitrary and very often cruel way in which nature crushes human beings and causes them immense suffering. And this is a difficulty for those people who wish to believe that the deity, if there is one, is a benevolent being and cares about and loves, and this is what conventional religion tells us, God loves, so loves the world, etc. But of course, it's not a problem for theologians who think that God is morally indifferent or even indeed cruel. You know, the gods make sport of us, as the Greeks thought. So it's a very particular problem, a very particular tradition of religious thinking, with a very particular conception of the deity as a being with emotions a little bit like ours, except much larger and nicer. The question is that consistent with the existence of natural evil? And the answer seems to me to be a very simple one. If I think of myself as a human father with lots of failings and flaws, the way I regard my children and how I would treat them and what I would protect them from, I find it inconceivable that anybody who bore that kind of relationship to other sentient beings could possibly allow those things to happen to them. So on the conventional, traditional view about the nature of the deity and the facts about how the world are, it seems to me that the argument from evil is a convincing argument that there cannot be a good God.
If there is some ultimate purpose for evil, the only way you can deal with that in a theological context is to have some kind of an afterlife that goes on forever. So if you give me an afterlife, I can start to deal with evil.
That's an implausible argument, because the idea of the felt moment, the idea of the reality of our experience of suffering, is such that you would have to be able to persuade somebody that very terrible kind of mental or physical agony is endurable for some greater good. You would be forced to ask, on what balance are you trying to measure that? And this is the kind of response that you give to the idea, even if there were an eternity posthumously. What about the moment now, that experience? Who, genuinely good and sympathetic, would want to inflict that on anybody?
Anthony has my emotions, and I endorse his arguments, save one. If there is an afterlife, if eternal life really is on offer, the rules change. The arguments against God melt. But natural evil must be scrutinized. I give no easy pass. Is there anything about the universe, the laws of nature, that might explain natural evil? I go to Berkeley to visit a minister with a doctorate in physics, the founder of the Center for Theology in the Natural Sciences, Robert John Russell. Bob, the problem of evil must be confronted by everyone who believes in God, not just theologians. How do you begin to get your arms around this question?
The traditional response for Christians, of course, is a kind of Garden Eden account where there's a fall, and the fall brings havoc to nature as well as to humanity. So you link moral evil, sin, with natural evil, suffering and death. Obviously, we're long past that in an evolutionary account of life. One piece I found helpful is been the work of Reinhold Niebuhr in his Gifford Lectures, where he said the logic behind Augustine's account of evil is that it's unnecessary but inevitable. That is, you want to avoid claiming that God creates evil or an evil world, the kind of Manichaean view that evil is, and suffering and sin is built into us by nature, by claiming it's unnecessary. It's not necessary that we commit moral evil. On the other hand, you can't get yourself out of the mire by your own sort of power of positive thinking. You need God's grace to pull you out of it. So it can't be just something which might not happen. It's got to be in some ways inevitable without grace. So his argument was that for Augustine, the historical fall gave you an account where it's not necessary because the fall is a historical event, but it's inevitable because once it happens to all of humanity in the world. Can you carry that logic of unnecessary but inevitable beyond the confines of a Garden of Eden account into an evolutionary world? As a physicist, I try to push the question one step further and say, is there something about physics which has this quality of it being involved in what we call the tragedies or suffering of the world, natural suffering, but it's also inevitable to the birth of life, to the growth of life? Interestingly, thermodynamics tends to play that role. Without thermodynamics, you couldn't have had evolution. You need the capacity for open thermodynamic systems to spontaneously increase in their complexity, but it also contributes to dissipation and disease and decay. I mean, thermodynamics underlies those irreversible processes which mark life in tragedy. So in a very interesting way, entropy as part of thermodynamics plays this double role.
Now, thermodynamics is very neutral. It's not a value.
No.
It's not good, bad, or anything.
No, but it's present in the phenomena which we would say constitute natural evil: suffering, disease, death, and extinction. The point to say is that the fundamental physical laws of nature are such that there will be a universe in which life evolves, but it'll evolve at a cost. And there you can't get off the hook so easily because God created this universe from a Christian perspective. And it's this universe with these laws of physics which we're talking about.
Can you have an ultimate good result with so much suffering, a littered history of such suffering?
A lot of folks call it horrendous evil, or evil that seems to go beyond the bounds of moral growth or whatever. I would agree completely. You cannot launch any sort of response to evil by saying somehow the end justifies the means. It can't. It doesn't in human relations. It doesn't in nature. So that gets us to a much more complicated problem, which was given that even in the laws of physics, the universe is such that there will be natural evil. What is God's intentions and purpose in all that? And it's got to be much more than bringing humanity to pass, or you have this means-end argument, which I reject. It's got to be that every species has some sort of infinite value to God in it of itself. There's an intrinsic value to all of life, and not just human life. So my view of our hope, our eschatology, our hope for the transformation of the universe is that all of life, all species, maybe even all individuals in species, have some role in that, if you like, heaven, new creation. That is, it isn't just about us. It's about the whole process, moment by moment by moment.
I face up to the problem of evil. The explanations, the theodicies, do work, technically, but they do not satisfy. I see little difference between natural and human evil. If an all-powerful God created all that exists, then all that exists includes all forms of evil. The atheistic argument, which weighs the massive amounts of evil, should trouble believers. But the theistic counter-argument, the great gap between God's mind and human mind, seems to bring the big fight to an early draw. But if that were all, I'd score more rounds for the atheist, because the theistic counter-argument cannot be falsified. So here's my take. Either the problem of evil refutes the existence of God, making God, as traditionally defined, incoherent and self-contradicting, or there is an afterlife and eternal life is on offer. Put simply, no afterlife, no God, because without an afterlife, the problem of evil cannot be solved. But to have an afterlife, we'd likely need a God, which makes my argument seem circular, which is unhelpful for getting closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.